The ship was too big to feel like a ship. Nina Reyes had been on warships before, human ones mostly. They smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee, and the particular anxiety of people living too close together for too long. They had low ceilings and narrow corridors, and the general feeling that someone had designed them in a hurry and never gone back to apologize. The Keldara was different. The Keldara had ceilings that disappeared into darkness, corridors wide enough to drive a transport through, walls that were not quite walls. They curved, slightly, the way the inside of a living thing curves, and they were the color of deep water in a place where no light reaches. The whole ship breathed with a low hum that Nina felt more in her back teeth than in her ears. She had been walking through it for 6 minutes, and she already felt approximately 3 inches tall. That, she knew, was the point. The sovereignty did not build things for comfort. They built things to remind you of the distance between where you stood and where they stood. Every corridor was an argument. Every ceiling was a sentence that ended with, "And you are very small, and you should not forget it." Nina Reyes did not intend to forget it. She also did not intend to let it work. She straightened her back, adjusted the data tablet under her arm, and followed the sovereignty escort, 2 tall, gray-armored figures, who had not said a single word to her since collecting her from the docking bay, into the negotiation chamber. The room was round. The table in the center was black and long, and had no chairs on the sovereignty side of it, which was either a cultural detail or a deliberate reminder that they did not plan to sit down for long. Nina pulled out the single chair on the human side, and sat in it, the way a person sits when they want a room to know they are comfortable, even when they are not. High Arbiter Soul was already there. He was tall. They were all tall, the sovereignty's administrative class, with the kind of face that looked like it had been designed to express nothing, and had been doing so faithfully for many years. His robes were the color of old blood. He held a flat document board in both hands, and he looked at Nina the way someone looks at a problem they have already solved. "Attaché Reyes," he said. His translator unit made his voice sound like 2 voices slightly out of sync with each other. "High Arbiter," she said. They began. The negotiation was, in the technical sense, going nowhere. Nina had expected this. The sovereignty had 11 human prisoners taken during the fall of Outpost Heron 14 months ago. The Human Federation wanted them back. The sovereignty wanted, in exchange, the coordinates of a military installation called Anchor Point, a deep space resupply hub that, if the sovereignty got hold of it, would give them a logistics advantage in the outer systems that would take the Federation a decade to counter. Nina was not authorized to give them Anchor Point. She was not going to give them Anchor Point. She had 3 alternative proposals prepared, each more creative than the last, and Soul rejected all 3 with the same expression, no expression, and the same measured tone, and the same implication underneath his words that the Federation should think carefully about how much it valued 11 lives against the cost of continuing to refuse. Nina thought carefully. She concluded the same thing she had concluded before sitting down. No Anchor Point. Soul picked up the document board. He was moving toward the end of the session now, the formal close that would set the next meeting date and commit both parties to nothing. Nina recognized the rhythm. She had been in enough of these rooms to know when a door was closing without slamming. She was already mentally composing her report to the Federation Council when Soel began reading the prisoner manifest aloud. This was procedure. Both parties confirmed the identities of those held. Nina had the list memorized. She listened with half her attention, while the other half started drafting sentences. Soel read the names. 1, 2, 3. A pause between each that was long enough to be formal, and short enough to mean nothing. 4, 5, 6. Nina was thinking about the phrasing of her 3rd paragraph. 7, 8, 9. And then Soel stopped. Not the pause between names. Not the procedural breath. He stopped, the way a person stops when they have read something twice and are reading it a third time to make sure. Nina's attention came back to the room all at once. Sol's eyes moved along the line on the board. His face had not changed. It never changed. But something had shifted in the quality of his stillness. The way a pond shifts when something moves beneath the surface without breaking it. He read the name. Eli Voss. He said it the way you say something you were not expecting to find in a place like this. Flat. Careful. Then he said nothing for a moment. Nina did not know why that name produced that pause. She knew the name. It was on her manifest. She had read all 11 files before boarding. But nothing in her briefing had told her why a sovereignty high arbiter would stop on it and look at it like a problem that had just changed shape. Kept her hands loose on the table. Soel set the board down. He told her formally that the session was concluded and that he would return to the Queen with updated information. He would contact her within a standard day cycle with the time of the next meeting. Nina nodded. She stood when he stood. She watched him gather himself the way powerful people gather themselves when they are working hard to look like they are not hurrying. He walked to the far door. His footsteps on the hard floor of the chamber were the only sound. The door opened. He passed through it. It closed behind him, and the silence it left was the kind of silence that means something has just changed and the room has not caught up yet. Nina stood at the table for a moment longer than she needed to. She looked at her own manifest, found the name, looked at it the way Soel had looked at it, trying to see what he had seen, trying to find the thing in it that had made a sovereignty high arbiter stop mid-sentence and decide he needed to talk to his queen. The name looked like a name. Eli Voss. Somewhere below her, on the holding level of the Keldara, 11 human prisoners were breathing recycled sovereignty air and waiting to find out if they were going home. She picked up her data tablet. She went to find out what she was missing. Queen Velkara pulled the file herself. This was not something she did. She had people who pulled files. She had people who summarized files, and people who summarized the summaries, and people whose entire purpose was to stand between her and raw information, so that her time was used only on things that had already been filtered into clarity. She had not personally accessed an intelligence archive in 6 orbital cycles. She did it now. She sat alone in her chamber, the deep chamber, not the audience room, not the place where she received ambassadors and signed treaties and watched species measure the distance between themselves and their own extinction. Her real chamber. The one with no decorations except the viewport and the long dark of space beyond it, and a single low chair that she had owned for longer than most civilizations had been keeping records. She opened the archive on the Battle of Outpost Heron. She had approved the bombardment order herself, 14 months ago, after receiving the 7th consecutive report that the ground assault had failed to breach the interior. She had read the casualty numbers. She had read the final assessment. She had set the file aside and moved on to the next thing, because there was always a next thing, and the Battle of Outpost Heron was by any reasonable measure a footnote. A small human way station on the edge of contested space, assigned 600 ground units and 2 orbital support ships, which was, by the Sovereignty's standard engagement calculus, approximately 4 times more force than necessary for a structure of that size and a garrison of that number. Outpost Heron should have been a 4-hour operation. It held for 11 days. Velkara read through the day-by-day accounts now the way she rarely read anything anymore. Slowly, with her full attention, looking for the shape underneath the numbers. Day 1. Ground units made initial contact. Light resistance. Standard defensive positions. Day 2. First breach attempt failed. Unexpected defensive configuration inside the structure. 3 sovereignty units lost. Day 3. Second breach attempt, failed. 11 units lost. Day 4. The numbers started to become strange. The structure was not large. The intelligence assessment had been correct about that. The sovereignty sensors were correct about the number of human defenders inside. 30 people, holding a way station designed for a crew of 20, with the supplies and ammunition that had been on hand when the sovereignty fleet arrived without warning. By day 4, those defenders should have been running low on everything. They were not acting like people running low on anything. The reports from sovereignty ground commanders on day 4, day 5, day 6. Velkara read them now with the particular attention she gave to things that had surprised her. All contained variations of the same observation. The human defenders were adapting. Each breach attempt encountered a different configuration inside. Positions that had been in one location the day before were gone. New defensive arrangements appeared that the sovereignty's tactical models had not predicted. It was not that the humans were winning. They were 30 people against 600, and they had no resupply, and no reinforcement, and nowhere to go. But they were not losing on the schedule the calculus required. On day 8, a sovereignty ground commander requested orbital bombardment. Velkara had denied it, not because she cared about the humans inside, but because the way station contained salvageable technology, and she did not want it destroyed before her engineers had a chance to examine it. Day 9, day 10, the requests came again. She denied them again. On day 11, she approved it. The structure was not worth the rate at which her ground units were being depleted. The math had shifted. She signed the order. The bombardment was thorough. When the salvage units moved through the rubble, 3 days after the bombardment, looking for the technology, cataloging the wreckage, one of them reported contact with living organisms in the lower sublevel. Velkara stopped reading. She had not known this part. The summary she had received at the time said, "Structure neutralized, materials assessment ongoing. No significant findings." That was what the summary said. And she had moved on to the next thing. The full file said something different. The salvage unit had found 2 of their own, sovereignty soldiers, from a ground assault team that had been cut off and declared lost on day 3. They were in bad shape, but they were alive. They were not alone. A human was with them. A human who, according to the salvage unit's report, had been providing medical care to the 2 sovereignty soldiers, using improvised materials in a sealed sublevel for approximately 72 hours after the bombardment. The sublevel had no power. It had no light. It had no medical supplies in any proper sense of the term. The human had not left them. He had not used their weapons, which were accessible. He had not barricaded himself away from them. He had torn his own clothing into strips. He had, according to the salvage unit's recorder, been in the middle of changing a wound dressing on the arm of one of the sovereignty soldiers, when the salvage team broke through the wall. He looked up at 6 armored sovereignty soldiers pointing weapons at him. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, through the translator unit one of the salvage team carried, that he would need more bandages. The salvage unit's report included, as an appendix, a note from the commanding officer that this human had been assessed as non-threatening and was transported to the holding level of the Keldara for processing. The note also recorded, without any apparent understanding of its significance, that both sovereignty soldiers had insisted on being transported in the same unit as the human. The human's name was recorded at the bottom of the report, Eli Voss. Velkara sat in the low chair in the dark of her chamber and looked at the name on the archive screen for a long time. She had spent 31 orbital cycles building an understanding of what living things do when they are frightened, when they are cornered, when the numbers are against them. She had observed it in hundreds of species across 14 systems. The pattern was always the same at the core. Under enough pressure, a living thing does what keeps itself alive. Everything else falls away. Loyalty, principle, compassion, they were all real things, but they had a threshold. And past the threshold, survival won. This was not cynicism. It was simple observation. She had never found an exception. She had read a lot of files. She had never read a file that told her a man had stayed in the dark for 3 days, with enemies, tending their wounds while his own side bombed everything above him, because as far as she could determine from the record, that was simply the thing that needed doing. There was no calculation in it that she could find. There was no survival advantage. There was no audience. He had not known anyone was watching, and it had made no difference at all to what he chose to do. She closed the archive. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then she said, to the empty room, to nobody in particular, in the tone of a person who has made a decision they are not entirely sure is wise, "Bring him to me." The order traveled through the ship's communication system to the holding level, where 11 human prisoners had been breathing recycled air for 14 months. Them were asleep. One of them was not. The holding level smelled like recycled air and old metal and something faintly chemical that Nina could not identify and decided not to try. The Sovereignty Guard walked her to a partitioned corridor, a row of clear-walled cells along one side, each one holding a cot, a water dispenser, and a small amount of personal space. Not cruel, not comfortable. The specific design of a place where people are stored rather than kept. She had been granted 1 hour. Limited access, the Sovereignty called it. Procedural courtesy following a stalled negotiation, which meant we are not ready to release them, but we are also not ready to be seen as refusing all contact. So here is 1 hour inside the line and nothing more. Nina had used procedural courtesies before. She was good at them. She stopped in front of the first cell. The man inside was asleep on his cot, facing the wall. She checked her manifest and moved to the next one. She went down the row. 4 of them were sleeping. 3 were awake, but quiet, looking at her with the particular expression of people who have been waiting for news for a long time and have practiced looking like they are not hoping. She stopped at each one, confirmed names, checked their visible condition, made notes on her tablet. She was at the 8th cell when someone spoke to her from the end of the corridor. "You're not a soldier," the voice said. Not rude, not particularly friendly, the tone of a person making an observation. She turned. The man in the last occupied cell was sitting on the edge of his cot, elbows on his knees, looking at her with the kind of calm that was either genuine or a very good imitation of it. He was not especially large. He had the look of someone who had been through something physical and had come out of it, carrying it very quietly. Brown hair, a few days past needing a cut, a face that had some weather in it. His hands, which were resting loosely on his knees, looked completely ordinary. Nina thought about that for 1 second longer than she meant to, then moved on. "No," she said, "I'm not." "Diplomat? Attaché?" He nodded as if that confirmed something he had already worked out. "Eli Voss," he said, though she already knew that. He said it the way people who do not trust titles say their names, straightforwardly, as a way of starting on equal ground. "Nina Reyes." She came to stand in front of his cell. "How are you?" He considered the question. "The food is not great," he said, "but it is consistent, which in my experience is more than you can say for most field rations. I have slept better here than I slept for the last 4 days of Heron." He paused. "The light is always on, which is a little strange. But I have made my peace with it." She looked at him. She was trying to fit him against his file, and the file was not cooperating. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay," he said. "The Queen has requested your presence in negotiations." He was quiet for a moment. "The good kind of requested," he said, or the kind that comes with an implied situation if I say no? Nina did not answer right away, because the honest answer was that she did not know, and the diplomatic answer was not going to fool this man. The kind I don't have full information on yet, she said, which was both true and useful. He nodded again. He did not look scared. He looked like a man doing a quiet calculation, and coming out the other side of it without too much drama. The other 10, he said, what is the situation? It was not quite a question. It was the thing he most wanted to know, shaped into language. Their release is the goal, she said. That has not changed. But it is not certain. Not yet. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said, I will go. Just that. She had expected more. A condition, a hesitation, a question about what exactly the Queen wanted, or what would happen to him if the conversation went badly. She was prepared for those questions. She had answers for 2 of them. He did not ask. She looked at her tablet to give herself something to do with her eyes. She pulled up his file, though she knew it. The dates of Heron, the 11 days, the bombardment clearance, the salvage report. She had a question she had been carrying since she read that report 3 days ago. She looked at the clean, ordinary lines of his hands and she asked it. After the bombardment, she said carefully, in the sublevel, the 2 sovereignty soldiers. You had access to their weapons. He looked at her. I know, he said. You didn't use them. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, they were not going to survive without help. They were not in a condition to be a threat. Using their weapons against what, exactly? The ceiling? He made a small sound that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. I am not in the habit of shooting the ceiling. She looked at him. She was trying to find the calculation in it, the way she was trained to find calculations in everything, and she could not find it. There was no angle. There was just a man who had been in a dark hole for 3 days and had spent that time doing the most available useful thing. After you were recovered, she said, the 2 sovereignty soldiers from the sublevel, they were released from active service rather than reassigned. He looked mildly interested. The sovereignty doesn't do that, she said. They don't release combat personnel without cause. There is no official explanation in any record I could access. He thought about this. He said. He seemed to genuinely not have known. He seemed to find it moderately interesting and not particularly surprising, in the way that some people absorb information about the world without needing the world to make sense. Nina put the tablet down. She had been in this corridor for 31 minutes. She had 29 left. She thought about telling him more, about Soul stopping on his name, about the particular quality of a powerful thing going quiet when it hears something it was not prepared for. She decided he probably did not need that wait before walking into a room with the ruler of 14 systems. Is there anything you need? She asked. He looked at the water dispenser, then at the ceiling, then back at her. Coffee, he said. Real coffee, not the powder kind. I'll see what I can do. I know you probably can't, he said pleasantly, but it is good to have a goal. She smiled at that despite herself. It came out before she managed to keep it professional. She was writing the last of her notes when the sovereignty guard returned to the corridor. One guard, stopping at the end of the row, looking at Eli's cell. Eli stood up. He did not wait to be told twice. He looked down the corridor at the other cells, at the 10 people who were asleep or awake, or somewhere in between, who were going home if Nina could make the numbers work. The other 10, he said. She met his eyes. She nodded. He turned and walked toward the guard without looking back. And Nina stood in the corridor for a moment after he was gone, looking at the space where he had been, trying to name the feeling she had, and deciding it was something close to being afraid for a person she had known for less than an hour, which was not useful. So she picked up her tablet and went to find out what the Sovereignty Queen wanted with a soldier who asked for bandages while surrounded by guns. The Queen's audience chamber was built to end arguments before they started. Eli noticed the ceiling first. He always noticed ceilings. An old habit from years of working in structures that might, at any moment, stop being structures and start being rubble. This ceiling was high enough that the top of it was lost in a kind of planned shadow, a darkness that the lighting below did not reach. It made the space feel less like a room and more like a throat. The floor was polished black stone. His boots made a sound on it with every step. 2 honor guards stood at the far end of the chamber. High Arbiter Soel stood to the left of the raised platform. The light in the room came from sources he could not locate, which meant the light came from everywhere and therefore from nowhere, and this he suspected was also deliberate. Queen Velcara sat on a throne that was not trying to be ornate. It was trying to be permanent. It looked like something that had always been there, and intended to continue to be there long after everyone in the room was gone. She was tall, sitting. Her skin was the gray-blue of deep ocean, and her eyes were very still, and they were on him from the moment he came through the door. He walked the length of the room. He had walked longer distances under worse conditions. He kept his hands loose at his sides. He stopped at the point where the floor changed color, a thin line of dark red stone that he figured was probably the point where visitors were supposed to stop. And he stood there. He looked at her. She looked at him. Soel drew a small breath and began the formal introduction, his translated voice filling the chamber with its double-layered sound. He said the names, the Human Federation, the attached rank and assignment. He moved through the procedural language with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done it many times. He said Eli's name, Eli Voss. Velcara, who had been still before, became a different kind of still. It was hard to say what changed exactly. She did not move. Her expression did not shift. But the quality of her attention, which had already been considerable, narrowed in a way that Eli felt in the back of his neck, like the moment before weather changes, when the air has already decided what it is going to do, and the rest of the world has not been told yet. Soel stopped speaking. The chamber was very quiet. Then she said his name, Eli Voss. She said it in her own language first, the sounds of the sovereignty's formal tongue wrapping around the human syllables with careful precision, and then in translated standard, and the translation came through flat and exact, but the original was something else. The original sounded like a word she had been thinking about for a long time and was only now saying out loud. He had not introduced himself. She had said his name before he had introduced himself. He filed this away. She leaned forward very slightly in the permanent throne, and she asked him a question. Not about Anchor Point, not about Heron, not about the 11 prisoners, or the Federation or the war that was still technically ongoing in 7 other systems. She asked, "Why did you treat them?" The chamber was the kind of quiet that had weight. Eli looked at her. He was doing the same calculation he did in most rooms, assessing the situation, finding the exits, understanding the power structure. The power structure here was very clear. He was a prisoner in a room full of her soldiers, in the middle of her ship, in the middle of her space. He was not afraid of her. He was not unaware of the situation. He just had a long history of situations where being afraid was a thing he could not afford, and the habit had stuck. He said, "They were hurt." 3 words. The chamber held them. Velcara did not respond. She looked at him in the way Eli imagined someone looks at a map when they have been reading it a long time and have just realized the scale is different from what they thought. Not shocked, not emotional. The slow, very serious look of someone recalculating from the beginning. Soel, to the left of the platform, was very still, in a different way than the Queen was still. He was still in the way of a person trying to understand what they were witnessing and not yet having the tools. He was good at waiting. You held Outpost Heron for 11 days, Velkara said. We did. 30 people. 31, he said. One of our people was behind the count the first day, caught outside when you arrived. She came in through a ventilation breach on day 2. The count was wrong in your records. Something moved behind Velkara's still eyes. Interest. The specific interest of someone who has been reading a report and has just found out the report was missing a line. You knew our records were wrong, she said. I knew what we had. And you did not correct our assessment. No, because an incorrect assessment served you. Because we were 31 people and you were 600, he said, and we used what we had. She was quiet for a moment. You were going to lose, she said. Yes. You knew you were going to lose. Yes, and you continued. He looked at her steadily. He said, there was a job. We did it until we couldn't. Velkara sat back in the throne. The silence this time was longer. Soel did not move. The honor guards did not move. The whole room seemed to be waiting for something, though Eli could not have said what. He thought about the last night, before the bombardment, when they all knew it was coming, and no one said so out loud, because there was still work to do, and saying it out loud would not have changed the work. He thought about the 2 sovereignty soldiers in the dark, hurt and confused, who had been enemies 8 hours before, and were simply hurt people now. He thought about how simple it had been, actually, to just do the thing that needed doing. He had never understood why other people found it complicated. Velkara said, you did not know my soldiers would survive. No. You did not know anyone would find you. No. You treated them anyway. They were hurt, he said again. Same words, same tone, like the answer had not changed because the question had not really changed. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, you may go. He looked at her. The 10 people in the holding level, he said. They will be released. All 10. All 10, she said. Something that was not quite relief moved through him. He kept it off his face. He nodded once, the way a person nods when a thing is settled, and they want to acknowledge the settling, without making it larger than it is. He turned and walked back across the black stone floor, past the line of dark red, past the guards, toward the door. He did not look back. Behind him, in the throne, Velkara watched him go, with the expression of a person who has just seen something they did not know existed, and is not yet sure what to do with the knowledge. The door closed. Soel waited. Velkara said quietly to the room, note him in the protected registry. The protected registry was for assets of significant strategic value, for individuals whose survival was considered important enough to the sovereignty's interests that they were formally excluded from targeting protocols. Velkara had never placed a prisoner of war in the protected registry. She had never placed a human in the protected registry. Soel said, yes, my queen. He did not ask why. He was not sure she would have an answer that used words he already knew. The release orders came through without conditions. Nina was in the small working room the sovereignty had assigned her, a gray cube with a flat desk and a light that buzzed faintly at a frequency just high enough to notice when her comm unit received the file. She opened it. She read it. She read it again. No conditions, no anchor point, no counteroffer, no schedule of follow-on negotiations. No list of demands dressed up as provisions. All 11 prisoners to be transferred to human custody at the docking bay within the hour. She sat with the document on the screen in front of her for a moment. Then she got up and started making the arrangements, because the 11 people on the holding level had been waiting for 14 months, and she was not going to make them wait one more hour for paperwork. The shuttle was not built for comfort. It was a Federation transit vessel, functional, gray, with seats that were exactly as soft as they needed to be and no more. It smelled like the fuel system and old rubber, and the particular relief of people who have stopped waiting for something bad to happen. 10 of the 11 were in the seats ahead of Nina, talking or quiet, or sleeping against each other's shoulders, in the boneless way of people who have finally decided it is safe to let their muscles unknot. One of them, a young woman named Dana Cole, who had been at Heron for the last 6 days of the hold, was crying without making a sound, the way you cry when you have been not crying for a very long time, and your body has finally decided it can stop being professional about it. Eli was across the aisle from Nina, 1 row back. He was looking out the viewport at the Caldara. The ship was enormous from this distance, a dark shape against the stars, too big to look like something that moved. He watched it, the way you watch something that has had you for 14 months, when you are finally far enough away to see the whole of it. Nina was watching him watch it. She had 100 questions and she could not decide which one to lead with, or whether to lead with any of them, or whether to simply sit here in the relief and not spoil it with debriefing instincts. "How long to the relay station?" he said, without turning from the viewport. "About 9 hours, she said. He nodded, turned from the window, leaned back in the seat with the ease of a man who has slept in worse places and knows it. "What I would give," he said thoughtfully, "for a real cup of coffee and approximately 4 days of horizontal sleep." "The debrief is going to be long," she said. "I know." He did not seem particularly bothered by this. Long debrief, bad food. Someone from intelligence who is going to ask the same question 17 different ways to see if the answer changes. He paused. "The answer will not change." "What is the answer?" He looked at her. "Which question?" She thought about how to say it. She thought about the Heron report, and Soul stopping on his name, and Velcara pulling the archive herself, and the protected registry that nobody went into without a very specific reason. "She let you all go," Nina said. "No conditions, no exchange, no anchor point, 14 months of leverage, and she gave it up in 1 meeting." She kept her voice even. "What did you say to her?" He thought about this. "She asked me why I treated the soldiers in the sub-level," he said. "I told her they were hurt." Nina waited for the rest. There was no rest. She looked at him. "That is the whole answer?" "That is the whole answer." She was good at sitting with things that did not compute, and working them through until they did. This one was taking longer than usual, and she just accepted that. She went quiet, he said, for a long time, and then she let everyone go. He shrugged, the small shrug of a man who has stopped trying to explain things that do not explain themselves and has made peace with the unexplaining. I do not know what she was thinking. I cannot tell you what she decided. I can tell you what I said. Nina looked out her own window. The Caldara was smaller now, still visible, but receding into the general dark of the system. She thought about a queen who governed 14 systems, sitting alone in a chamber, pulling an archive file herself, trying to understand a man who had stayed in a hole in the dark and changed wound dressings because it needed doing. She thought that some things did not yield to analysis. Some things just were what they were, and the analysis slid off them. On the Caldara, Velcara stood at the viewport in her deep chamber. The shuttle was a small light now, a moving point among the fixed ones. She watched it. Soel entered. He moved quietly, as he always did, with the particular care of a person who had spent many years in the presence of someone whose moods could be weather. "The protected registry entry has been logged," he said. She nodded, still watching the shuttle. "My queen," Soel said. He paused, in the way he paused when he wanted to ask something and was weighing the cost of asking. "What was it, about the human?" Velcara was quiet. The shuttle was getting harder to see now. In a few minutes, it would make the transit jump, and there would be nothing where it had been. She said, "He did not know I was watching." Soel waited. In the sub-level, after the bombardment, there was no audience, no record being made that he was aware of. No reason to behave in any particular way. She watched the light that was the shuttle. He treated them anyway. Not because anyone would know, not because it would save him, not because it was strategy. A pause. Because they were in front of him, and they needed it. Soel considered this. I don't understand the significance, he said honestly. I know, she said. I spent 31 cycles believing that what a living thing does, when no one is watching, tells you what it really is. I believe that pressure reveals the truth of a thing. Strip away the audience, strip away the benefit, leave nothing but the situation and the choice. And what is left is the real nature. She turned from the viewport. I was right, she said. That is what is left. That is exactly what is left. She walked to her desk. She sat down. Pull every file we have on human history, she told Soel. Not military files. Not strategy. Their full recorded history. Their stories. The people they remember. The ones they build monuments to, and the ones they name their children after, and the ones they write down so their grandchildren will know they existed. Soel was looking at her with the expression of a person who has worked beside someone for 11 years and is seeing something new in their face. My queen, he said, that is a significant amount of material. I know. She opened the desk archive. I have time. He did not move immediately. You believe there are more like him, Soel said. Velkara looked at the blank archive screen. I believe, she said carefully, that he is not the exception. I believe we have been reading the wrong files. I want to understand what makes a species produce a person who goes into the dark, with nothing, for people who were his enemies that morning, and does not leave them. She looked at Soel. I want to understand where that comes from, what it is built on, what it costs them, and what they decide it is worth. Soel stood quietly for a moment. And when you understand it, he said. Velkara looked back at the archive. I don't know yet, she said. That is the first time in a very long time I have said that. Something moved in her face that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. I find I don't mind it. She began to read. On the shuttle 9 hours from the relay station, Eli Voss had fallen asleep in his seat. His head had tilted against the bulkhead. His breathing was slow and even and completely ordinary. Nina looked at him for a moment. She thought about the queen of 14 systems, sitting in the dark of a warship, pulling human history, file by file, and trying to find the place where a person like this came from. She thought about the fact that Eli would find this mildly interesting, and then ask again about the coffee. She covered him with the single blanket from the overhead storage. She went back to writing her report. Outside, the stars went on in every direction, indifferent and enormous. And somewhere in the middle of them, 2 ships moved away from each other into the dark, carrying each of them something they had not expected to find.